Hello, and today let's talk about the French Revolution. Specifically, let's talk about the causes of the French Revolution, what leads up to it, and what actually precipitates and gets it going. Next time we'll talk about the course of the French Revolution a little bit in more depth. So what did cause the French Revolution? Historians have been trying to explain that for several centuries, and we have all different kinds of theories. So what I'll propose today is to simply talk about some of those theories, or at least some of the ideas, because we certainly know the French Revolution did occur, and there were many causes, and it's very hard to say which is more important than the other. So let me just detail what they were. First of all, we've already discussed the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment gave us the intellectual causes because the number of figures we've already talked about made tremendous contributions to the ideas that the French Revolution would actually defend, would actually be fought to bring about. For example, John Locke talking about inalienable rights. The whole idea of rights is something very new, certainly in 17th century and 18th century. Nobody in society back then would have even thought or defended the notion that we have inalienable rights that we're born with and that we bring into society with, which cannot be taken away by king or anybody else. So Locke gives us this notion of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, as he put it, pursuit of happiness being property, and property being, of course, something which was sacrosanct. The state should not have the right to interfere with anybody's personal happiness in property, holding of property. That's John Locke. Others, Montesquieu we've talked about, but Montesquieu gives us the idea of division of power. He may have been defending the historic privileges, or as he called them, rights of the aristocracy, the nobility. Nevertheless, this notion that power should be divided and it should not all belong to the monarch was a very powerful argument for some sort of democracy, really, at least some limitation put on the crown. So that's a very important point. We talked about Rousseau before. Rousseau gives us a number of things. One of them, the notion of popular sovereignty. The notion, above all, that the common good comes before everything else. The notion that in order to have the common good, you have to have social equality, something that France certainly did not have, and something that Rousseau was very much in favor of and an advocate for as somebody who comes out of the working class of that day. So popular sovereignty, again, the defense of the inalienable rights, the notion of social equality, all of these things are going to be very important points the French Revolution. So the intellectual causes are extremely profound because they really are saying that everybody should be a citizen and not just a subject. Everybody should have equal rights. For Locke, equal rights before the law. For Rousseau, equal social rights, equal economic rights, division of property, all these things extremely important. Other things, of course, other causes. Well, the American Revolution, for one, happened not so many years prior to the French Revolution. Some would say that the American Revolution was inspired by the French Revolution. Many would say that the American Revolution also inspires the French Revolution. Whichever way you look at it, no doubt the American Revolution establishes the principle of the challenge to the crown, that the crown should not have unlimited authority. The crown cannot tax as it pleases. The crown cannot take away your property. So the American Revolution really inspires the notion of constitutional limitations on a king, or let's say even getting rid of the king. So you have this. So after the American Revolution, a number of other things. So in France, in the 18th century, you have vast inequality, vast social and economic problems. And so social and economic problems certainly has to rate very high up in the pyramid of what leads to the French Revolution. For one thing, much of the land that's tillable, much of the best land in France is actually owned by the nobility, which only amounts to, at the very most, 5% of the population. Other parts of France belong to what's called the first estate in the 18th century, and that's the clergy, that's the church. They may have constituted 1% of the population, but the church actually controls quite a bit of the land, something like 10% of the land. In addition to that, you have what we can call the bourgeoisie, These would be people who are essentially men of wealth, men of property, but they're also locked out of French society because they don't hold monopolies. There were companies which had the privilege of trade, and they held these as monopolies. Well, if you're a merchant, or a would-be merchant, you would find tremendous difficulty breaking into the whole commercial apparatus because of the monopoly. So, interestingly enough, these men of wealth and property simply want the opening up of things. They want to get rid of the monopolies. They want to open up trade and commerce so that they are competitive. So, very interesting. They want a fundamental change. And the other group, well, lawyers. These are lawyers. It seems like lawyers are quite often involved in revolutions, but in any case, in France, high office was pretty much a monopoly. It belonged to what was called a nobility or noblesse de robe. These had been commoners who were actually elevated and given titles. So the kings actually backed this so that they would actually be sort of competitive, or they would actually kind of derail the other nobility, the noblesse de paix, the nobility of the sword. These are the medieval nobility. So you have would-be, you have people who want to break into office, who want to open up office to merit, and that's going to constitute a very powerful urge in the coming of the revolution. Beyond that, you have political causes, of course, and they're numerous. The kings were more or less unprepared for their tasks. The kings also inherit quite a bit of overhang in terms of debt, unable to really deal with that. Louis XV was quite young when he came to the throne, was uninterested essentially in governance. Louis XVI, likewise, who becomes the king in 1774. These were people who stood on their privileges, who regarded themselves still as pretty much absolutist kings. And then, of course, the wife, the queen of Louis XVI was Marie Antoinette, who was Austrian, did not speak French so well, and in any case regarded many of the French with contempt. So you have a ruling clique at the top, the royal house, which is very much indifferent to the French themselves, and is determined not to allow any kind of reform. And let me just go back to some of the problems with the social and economic problems, which ties into the next cause actually, and that is the financial crisis. Very much of a financial crisis in France because of wars that had been fought earlier by Louis XIV, huge debt overhang in the 18th century. It doesn't get any better because of the 7-Year War between the French and the English between 1756 1763. And there's just tremendous debt, and there's no way to really overcome that problem because about 50% of the French budget was actually spent on debt, just servicing the debt. And another 5 to 10% was spent simply maintaining the Palace of Versailles, where the king resided and where many of the nobility also were. So you have essentially an ongoing financial crisis, and it's made even worse because France had a system then where much of the much of the tax money was actually collected by what they call tax farmers. This was a position that was sanctioned by the government, of course, but tax farmers were the ones collecting taxes, and then they would pay a certain percentage to the crown, of course, but they kept some for themselves. It was a very inefficient system, let's put it like that. It was not a system that was designed to do anything about liquidating the debt. So the fact that the government does not essentially collect its own taxes, yet another problem. Lots of resentment, of course. The peasantry, to go back to some of the social causes, peasants were paying taxes to everybody, it seems. They had to pay taxes to their landlords, the nobles. They had to pay taxes of the tithe to the church. And there seems to be no end to the payment of taxes for them. the tithe, the head tax. And not only that, but many of these taxes are now going to be collected in real money and not just in kind, not just in crops. And that's becoming more and more of a problem as you get closer to the revolution. When you begin to add all of these things up, the intellectual causes, the financial overhang, the social and economic grievances, and there were certainly many of those, then you end up with a really dysfunctional government. You end up with a king whose privileges and whose sort of monopoly of power becomes more and more challenged, and really more and more challenged all the way across the board, all the way from the medieval or landed nobility with its inherited privileges, which are now coming under some opposition from more and more from the crown, the noblesse de robe, those who have these privileged offices and the privilege of collecting taxes in some cases, right? The monopolists who control the trade. Well, all of those folks want to preserve their privileges, and all of those folks are being challenged more by the monarchy, which needs to raise money from them. It's all going to come to a head when the king essentially looks to these elites and tries to get them to make, essentially make the crown a loan. They refuse. They say, why don't you call the Estates General? The Estates General being the three estates that I mentioned before. The first, the church, the second, the nobility, and the third, of course, everybody else, the roturier, or the commoners. And so the king finally has no choice. He has to call them into session. And they will be called. They will arrive 1788. They'll be asked to deliberate. He's really wanting them to sanction a loan to the crown to help make it solvent. They, of course, are not interested in that. What they're more interested in, especially the third estate, what they're more interested in saying is, well, we are not here to give you a loan. We are here to transform France. And a pamphlet that will come out a little bit later, authored by the Abbé Sieyès, will say, what is the third estate today? Nothing. What should it be? Everything. And what's going to happen is the third estate is going to end up in the famous May pronouncement of the Tennis Court Oath, where it proclaims itself to be everything, proclaims itself to be the National Assembly of France, and it's going to argue that the estates should not meet separately, they should meet together, but it argues that it is the governing, or at least the legislative body, it is the National Assembly of France. That's the beginning of the revolution. The grievances have finally come to that, and that's the beginning of the end for the king. Next time we'll talk about how everything comes about and evolves.